It all started with the death of my grandmother. It was winter out of seasons, and the cold had completely enveloped everything. I was studying at the university at that time. One day, my father called and told me that my grandmother had passed away and that I should come to my hometown. So I set off in my junk car at dawn and arrived at the village in the morning as soon as possible, because the time for the funeral was approaching. Everyone had gathered in front of my grandmother's house. Our parents were also inside the house. A few people from outside wished me well, so I thanked them. Then I went out on the balcony, took off my shoes, and headed for the anteroom to go inside. The anteroom was very crowded because it was a funeral home, and all the women's heads were covered. Those who could not fit into the room where my grandmother was also standing were waiting in the entrance hall. Here, in the Aegean, the elderly usually cover their heads in this way. Anyway, I probably didn't dwell on the fact that this is how they dress at a funeral. I saluted the women in loincloths standing in the entrance hall with my head, but they did not receive my greeting. They were already not looking at me. They had bowed their faces to the ground. I went into the room. When I came in, I saw my mom and dad. The entire funeral was covered with a blanket, and they put a knife in the middle of his stomach. There were several other people from the relatives in the room. They were all collapsed on the cedars on the floor, looking at the floor. When my mother saw me, she made a sit sign with her eyes. I sat down where I was. However, there was one thing that caught my attention. There was no mourning mood in the house, or so it seemed to me. Anyway, after a few minutes passed quietly, other women came in. They were going to take the funeral to wash. 4 women held blanket-wrapped funeral at all 4 ends, lifted it into the air, and began to take it away. They moved towards the anteroom. I was watching them too. I stood up so that I could help if they were having trouble moving. Meanwhile, I looked at the women in loincloths in the entrance hall. They were just looking at the floor. Even stranger were the women in loincloths, who did not give way to the funeral that 4 people were trying to carry in the already narrow entrance, lined up like idols on the side of the wall and facing the ground. The women who took the funeral out of the entrance hall were also trying to get stuck without any reaction to this situation. I was saying, look at the lack of understanding in me. When we went to the cemetery to bury the body a few hours later, we carried the coffin from hand to hand. In our places, only men usually attend funeral prayers, although I don't know if women can do it either. But at the funeral, where normally no women are expected to come, this time there were 4 women. These were the women I saw, standing in the entrance hall. Since I had passed by them, I knew their height and posture. I was sure that they were them. Now, they were standing separately from everyone, but in a corner where they could see everyone, with their faces tilted to the ground. I was wondering why they were always looking at the ground. Besides, they didn't attract my attention when they were transporting the funeral. When we put the coffin on the haunting stone and kept it clean for funeral prayers, I realized how suddenly they ended up there. I looked at everyone's face. No one was looking in the direction where those women were. It was as if they were not anyone's acquaintances. Perhaps only my deceased grandmother knew them. I was going to find out what they were later. While the teacher was performing the prayer, I had one eye on them. During the entire prayer, they waited with their heads bowed forward. They did not even move at all. Until the prayer ends and the teacher says, "Are you making your rites lawful?" Until he asked. When the whole congregation was saying, "May it be halal," I was hearing a different voice. It would be more accurate to say a different sentence than the one that comes out of everyone's mouth. For some reason, my eye went to the side where there were women in loincloths. These sounds, which were already strange, had led me to look at them for no reason. And I was wrong. The voice was coming from them. I could see their mouths moving, but their faces were still staring at the ground. Seeing these beings standing like idols talking for no reason, it struck a fear into me. Tuesday, Kalayu, Ween, Jinaya, they were saying all four of them at once, in four different tones of voice. Although they were at a distance that could be considered remote to me, their voices were so loud and full of obscurity, but no one was looking in that direction, except me. Only I seemed to hear. "I don't ask anyone, who are these? What are they?" I couldn't ask because everyone was interested in the funeral. While lifting the funeral from the musalla stone and carrying it to the grave, I was pulled out of my thoughts by my cousin Turgut's nudge and helped to carry the coffin. When we got to the grave, we put the coffin on the ground. My father and the teacher opened the coffin and placed the body in the grave. While the funeral was being placed in the grave, a sheet was stretched around the grave. Then the teacher placed the boards diagonally, and we started throwing soil into the grave. After throwing a few shovels, I gave the shovel to the man next to me. I turned around to get away a little, so as not to make a crowd at the grave. As soon as I turned around, I saw one of the women in loincloths standing right behind me, with her head tilted forward. When he suddenly appeared in front of me, my face dropped. I got goosebumps. I took a few steps back in panic and hit someone behind me. For a moment, I turned my head to the person I hit and looked in front of me without apologizing, but there was no woman. The woman in loincloth who had just stood in front of me had disappeared in a second. I looked around. I thought he might have decamped among the crowd, but I could not see, because everyone at the funeral was a man. I would have noticed him right away, but he wasn't there. What is this now? Am I too obsessed with women in loincloths? Am I dreaming? While I was thinking, I looked at the place where four loincloth-clad women were standing. There were none. After the funeral, my mother, father, and our relatives stayed at my grandmother's house to welcome those who had come to express their condolences. I, on the other hand, went to our own house in order to relieve the fatigue of the road and get some rest. The houses were close to each other. After lighting a cigarette and smoking, I went to sleep and woke up with a gawk. I was feeling quite rested when I saw that no one was at home. Thinking that they were at my grandmother's house, I grabbed a few snacks and went out. It was getting quite dark. Since my grandmother's house was close to us, I arrived after walking for a few minutes. My parents had lit a fire outside so that those who came to offer condolences wouldn't get cold. Only men were sitting outside while women were inside the house. The teacher came, read the molid, and everyone gradually dispersed. Our relatives were the last to stay. We went in because we were cold. While the bite distribution plans were being made, I went out because I was bored and my smoking crisis came. I sat down on one of the chairs around the fire. I was both smoking my cigarette and thinking. At this time, I heard a gradually increasing sound from the street ahead. When I first came home, the women in loincloths I saw in the entrance hall and then at the funeral were passing along the street opposite. 4 of them were lined up next to each other. Their faces were tilted to the ground again, but this time they were silent. Only footsteps could be heard. Do not think of these footsteps as the sound of shoes. They were naked footsteps coming. I was frozen in the chair I was sitting in. I couldn't even move. I could only look towards the women. Put yourself in my shoes. 4 women in loincloths, covered everywhere, walking alone in a dark street at night, their faces tilted to the ground, and every time they step on the ground, you realize that their feet are bare. While I was frozen like this and could only look at them, the door of the house opened. Reflexively, I immediately looked at the door. It was my uncle who came out from inside. I looked at the street and the road again. There was nothing anymore. I was sure that strange things were happening. When we passed our own house in the evening, I said to my father, "Dad, do you know the women in loincloths at the cemetery?" "What woman? What are you saying?" said. "Didn't you see those women in the cemetery?" I said, "My son, don't talk nonsense. What should women do at the funeral prayer?" Already, my head is like a balloon. I've been dealing with the funeral business for worlds, who comes and goes, and I have to deal with these stupid questions of yours, said. How so? How can my father not see the women I see with my eyes, whose voices I hear? I thought so. Or did I really just see it? Is that why no one was looking at them? But how could such a thing have happened? While he was thinking, my father said, "Forget about him and go yours. I'll check to see if the door is left open or something. Now, if they hear that Grandma has died and know that the house is empty, a thief or something will come. Something will be stolen. He has to. Fine, okay, let me see," I said. I went to my grandmother's house. I had a feeling that was bothering me. I wanted to go back as soon as possible. Anyway, I got to my grandmother's house. I went out to the balcony. I checked the door first. It was open. "Dad, how can you be so careless?" "You left the door unlocked," I sighed. "Anyway," I said, "I'll at least check to see if anything was stolen from inside." I opened the door and went in and lit the lamp. Everything was in a mess inside. All the belongings were scattered on the floors. The photos on the walls fell down. What happened here? The evening was not like this, I thought. As I was looking around, a single photo on the wall caught my attention. It had not fallen to the ground like the others. I moved forward to examine it more closely. It was a photo of Grandpa and Grandma. They were both sitting next to each other on the sofa bed, smiling. After examining it a little, a detail in the left corner of the photo caught my attention. There was someone else in the photo, but only part of it was visible. Even seeing this much of it was enough for me to remember something. This was one of the women in loincloths. A shudder covered me inside. At that moment, the glass clicked. I immediately turned around. For a moment, it was as if I saw someone pass by the window. But I tried to encourage myself, thinking that maybe that's how I saw it. I must go to my own house at once, I thought. As I took a step towards the door, the lamp in the room went out. I was left in the dark, alone with my fears. A few seconds later, the lamp turned on again, and I saw them in front of the window, those 4 women in loincloths. They were standing with their faces tilted to the ground, motionless. "Who are you?" I shouted. There is no answer. I shouted again. "Who are you?" Again, there is no answer. When he was about to ask again, the lamp went out again, and immediately after, again. I immediately looked at the window. The women in loincloths had disappeared. I immediately ran out of the house. But what a run! I learned that night what it's like to run with my heels hitting my chest. As I opened the door in a panic, my family came to the door. My mother, father, and brother. That is, everyone. "What is it? Why did you run?" my mother asked. I saw 4 women outside my grandmother's house, through the window, I said. "They stared at me for a while, then they ran away," I added. My father immediately went to look outside. I sat in the hall and waited. My mother brought water, saying, "You'll come to. You're scared." I drank it. About 10 minutes later, my father arrived. "Did you lock the door and come running here?" Said, "What lock-up, Dad? I left it as it was. I didn't know how I escaped." The interior of the house was also messy. The photos on the wall and so on always fell to the floor. "You saw it too, didn't you?" I said to my father. "What are you saying, my son?" The interior of the house was exactly as we left it when we tidy. The door was already locked, he said. What was this guy saying? How could he say there is no such thing to what I have just experienced personally, what I have seen? Was I going crazy, or was there something strange about those around me? Okay, never mind. I fumbled and went to my room. My goal was to get my head together a little bit. Which is a dream, which is a reality. Who said it was true? I was getting confused. The next day, on the 2nd day of my arrival there, I left saying, "I have an exam. I have to go." Actually, I didn't have an exam. I just wanted to get away from here without going crazy. When I left, my father asked me to leave the car. "There is a Mevrook job or something. I need it," he says. So I had to quit, and I was returning by bus to the city where I was studying at university. Anyway, I got to the city. The journey had taken about 2 hours. I jumped into the service and got off in front of the dormitory. It was quite late. There was only 1 light on in the dorm rooms, so most of the people had gone to bed. I looked into our room. A rickety blue light was burning, so it was a nightlight. My roommates had also gone to bed. Anyway, I went into the room, opened the door. I had a small bag with me where I put my things. I was opening them and placing them in my closet, looking at the men lying in their beds in the weak blue light of the night lamp. Who the hell are they? I thought so. They didn't look like my roommates at all. Did I come to the wrong room? I got suspicious and decided to look at the room number on the door. I opened the door and looked outside. Yes, it was true. It was my room number written on the door. Then who are the people sleeping in the room? I thought so. Come on, if someone was a different person, I wouldn't suspect anything. But they were all other guys. Otherwise, I saw the wrong thing. In the semi-dark room, I turned on the light of the room and turned on the children's faces. This time, I looked carefully at the faces of the sleepers. No, I did not recognize any of them. Today, I found out that someone new has moved in. How could anyone do such a thing without telling me? I wonder if all my roommates left at once. While these questions were going through my head, the desire to smoke appeared. It was always like this when I was confused. To collect my thoughts, I lit a cigarette, went to the window, and opened the window. I was trying to collect my thoughts as I pulled out a cigarette when the lamp in the room went out. A few seconds later, it lit up again. As I turned around and wondered why the lamp had been turned off and on, I couldn't even swear in the face of what I saw. In the middle of the room, 4 women in loincloths were standing, their faces tilted to the ground. They kept saying the same things. K lela yanjinaya. K lela shh ya. Their voices echoed in the room. It must have been the sounds. The children I didn't know in the room also woke up, and they all suddenly went to the women in loincloths. They all started saying the same sentence, facing me, Kalahuinjinaya, but they weren't looking at the ground like women. I could see their faces. His eyes were completely white, not like a human eye. They had no pupils. Then someone approached me. I couldn't move from where I was. After getting close to me, he shouted, Tavolamri, in a tone of voice that was not normal, that I had never heard from anyone before. I woke up, startled, and looked around. I was on the bus. I looked outside. The sky was bright. What a strange dream this was. It seemed like it was real. I looked at the clock. It hadn't been half an hour since I left. I took a deep breath, and along the way, I never slept under the influence of the dream. I arrived at the city, the dormitory where I studied at the university. There was no one in the room. Everyone should have been at school because it was still daytime. It must have been both from the fatigue of the road and the effect of the dream. I changed my clothes, lay down on the bed, and tried to get some sleep. When I woke up, the room was dark. Had become night. While I was struggling in bed for a few minutes and trying to come to my senses, I heard voices outside the door. My roommates' voices were coming. I was relieved at that moment. Even if you don't want to, you are under the influence of the dream. They opened the door, then turned on the light, but what I saw was not the same as what I expected. The people who came were the same people I saw in my dream. I remembered them very clearly. When they entered the room and saw me, one of them said, "Brother, welcome." "My condolences again." "No, why are you here so early?" Said. His voice was the voice of my roommate Kadir, but his image was different. It wasn't him. How could such a thing happen? May Allah not grant anyone to see someone whose voice is familiar to him, but whose image is someone else. I stayed as if my tongue was held. I couldn't speak. What can you talk about in this case, anyway? In front of me, he was looking at me as if he was waiting for an answer from me. This, my inability to answer, would have attracted the attention of others, so that others also began to look at me. "Are you all right, brother?" "What is it?" He said it again. I still couldn't believe it. It was Kadir's voice, but the image that came was the same as the one I saw in my dream. When he started coming towards me, "Don't come," I said. "Stop. Get away from me." "What is it, La?" he said in front of me. "Who are you?" I said. "Kadir Ben, don't you recognize?" Said. "Have you become a sleeping idiot, or have you lost your sight?" Said. What was he saying in front of me? Or was I really seeing it wrong? But no, everything was clear in front of me. The voice was Kadir's voice, but the image was not his. "Get away from me," I said, and got out of bed. I headed for the door. The people in front of me, who introduced themselves as my roommate, were just looking at me. I hastily opened the door and immediately ran to the manager's room. I looked into the room. The manager was still there because his light was on. He looked out of the window. I went straight in without knocking on his door, but there was someone else in front of me instead of the manager. It crossed my mind that everything that happened in the room would also happen here, but just to be sure, I asked, in case someone else was looking instead. "I was looking for the manager," I said. The man in front of me, after looking at me strangely, said, "You probably don't recognize me, son." "Don't you recognize me? I'm Turhan Abin, manager," he said. At that time, he looked behind me. When he looked, I looked behind me. The people in the room behind me, they had followed me. "What happened to it?" the man in front of me said to those who came from the room. He was talking about me. They shook their heads in the sense of "we don't know," too. And I left the room with a momentary reflex, decamped from the dormitory among those waiting at the door. I was crying, but when I ran away, what was this I was going through? Was it all a trick my mind was playing on me? Both tired and a little away from the dormitory, I sat down on a bench. I was shaking with fear and confusion. Of course, it was also difficult for me to light a cigarette. After what I had seen and experienced, I could not return to my homeland. So I called a friend I knew from class who was staying at home. "Can I stay with you today?" I said. "Of course, you can stay." "Did something happen in the dorm?" Said. "I'll tell you when I get home," I said. My best friend in the class was Burke, I even threw a girl at his house a few times. Anyway, I got there and knocked on his door, but there was a fear inside me. What if my experiences in the dormitory happen to me here as well? What if Burkeye doesn't look like I know him either? Then I wonder if I'll go crazy now. While thinking about these things, he opened the door. He was the Burkeye I knew. "Brother, has something bad happened?" he said as soon as he opened the door. Damn, was it so obvious what I was going through? Did it hit me in the face? Maybe I got bored at home and came to you. Is that how a person is asked directly? When I was thinking, shall we talk at the door? We'll talk inside, I said. We went inside. She had put tea. She brought it from the kitchen before I arrived and put it in cups. I lit a cigarette next to the tea and started to tell what I had experienced. I told them, all without skipping a word. After I had finished, he said quite knowingly, "There are such things, brother. One of my distant relatives experienced something similar to what you experienced, although not exactly the same," he said. So that was the reason why he greeted her in such a calm and knowledgeable way. What is the reason of all this? I said, "Those who are afraid also say with 3 letters, may they be at a good hour, but everyone is afraid to mention his name. But what they all mean is genie," he said. I was afraid of the word jinn because I never thought such a thing would happen to me. Who would have thought it before anyway? These were unimaginable things. What happened to your relative? I said to Burkay. He began to explain. I have never seen my relative that person. He lived long before I was born. My grandmother used to tell me, and she used to say, he mixed them up. Well, how did it happen? I said. He went on to explain. They called him Zaffa, the beekeeper. He walks around lowland, mountain hives. He ensures that bees feed from the most abundant flowering places and make honey. And at night, he usually did not leave the head of the hives so that bears or wild animals would not pillage the hives. Sometimes he was by himself, sometimes with friends. But one day, while waiting for the hives, just as he was about to fall asleep, he heard a clicking sound. Of course, he got up immediately, looked at the hives in panic, but there's nothing. Of course, he wondered where the sound came from. He started looking around with a gas lamp in his hand. After a little progress, he saw them. What did you see, my son? Do not tell the mysterious mystery, I said to Burkay, a little harshly, and he went on to explain. I saw them, he said. A quiet caravan. There was a bride on a horse in the front, and people walking in rows behind her. But the strange thing is that the horse and those around him were walking backwards, not forwards, but the opposite of the direction in which their faces were looking. Of course, Mustafa, the beekeeper, immediately understood that they were a wedding caravan of genies. He threw himself where he was, hid. The caravan passed by without noticing him, or so beekeeper Mustafa thought. Mustafa, the beekeeper, waited until morning. With the first light of the morning, he left his hives and everything behind and returned to the village. But after this incident, The villagers noticed that he was in strange states and movements. He goes to the mountains around the village by himself during the daytime and does not return from there for 2-3 days. One day, his brother became suspicious of this situation and followed him one day when he went to the mountain. After following Mustafa, the beekeeper, for quite a while, Mustafa stood in front of an alcove and shouted in an incomprehensible language towards the alcove. A while after he shouted, he opened his arms and started making movements as if hugging someone. His brother was both scared by this situation and thought that Mustafa was going crazy, and stopped watching him and walked towards him. Mustafa, the beekeeper, who noticed her coming, tried to push her away. "Go," he said to his brother with anger and panic. "Just go. Leave me alone with them." "Who are they?" His brother said. "Those around you are looking at you right now. You can't see them. Get out of here right now," he said. His brother, unable to understand what he was telling, did what beekeeper Mustafa said out of fear and left. After that moment, no one has seen or heard from Mustafa, the beekeeper. They will say he has gone mad, and they will say he has confused them. It is difficult to get rid of them. Whatever they've been haunting you with, they're not going to let go of it easily. Isn't there a way out of this, brother? Or am I going to get involved with them and leave? Will I be someone who sees invisible things around me, sees visible things differently? I said, "We need to find out how these things haunt you," he said. "How are we to find out?" I said, "We need to go to someone who is competent in these things," he said. A few days later, we got out of the car and knocked on the door of a house just as it was starting to get dark. At that time, I was like, should we go back? I couldn't help thinking, because even the way we came seemed scary to me for some reason. Maybe it was related to what I was going through. Burkai never told me how he knew about this place. While I was thinking these thoughts, the door opened, and an elderly, wrinkled-faced woman wearing a black hijab came out from inside. "Directly, what do you want?" he asked. I couldn't answer for the first few seconds. When I was about to answer, Burke spoke for me. "We were going to consult you about something," he could only say. "What?" said the woman. Burke, pointing at me, said, "I think a spell has been cast on my friend, or they are haunting him." "Come on in," the woman said. We went inside with Burkai. There were no proper things in the house. There were various colored waters in glass jars placed on a table or whatever. There was a paper written in Arabic on the wall. Later, I received that paper. I will send you his photo. A human drawing had been made on the wall, opposite the wall where the Arabic written paper was located. A spell I witnessed later was the same as the one drawn, only in a bigger way on this wall. While examining the house, the fortune-teller woman said, "Sit down." Burkai and I looked, but there was no sofa bed, no armchair, no chair, or anything to sit on. He will have noticed that we were thinking about this, so he said, "Get down on the ground." His voice was commanding. We did what they said immediately. "I will call him to find out if anyone is haunting you or not," he said. "But do not read prayers when you are afraid. The genie I will call is not from the Muslim Taifa." When I heard the word "do not call a genie," my eyes opened like a fortune teller. I looked at Burke. He was looking at the ground. He had closed his eyes. Where have I fallen to? He was probably chasing a madman, and but it wasn't me who was to blame for this. He brought me here himself. The woman left the place where we were. Burke and I, on the other hand, were not moving even for a little bit. Then the fortune-teller woman came with the bread and a Quran in her hand. He opened the Quran. Something happened that caught my attention. He tore out some pages. The fortune-teller tore open the page she was opening. I was like, what is this crazy person doing? I was thinking inwardly. He put down the page he had torn. He put the bread he had brought on top of it. He squatted down on the Quran and bread, as if we weren't in the room, started peeing. I was looking at what was happening with surprise and fear. I looked at Burke. His eyes were looking at the woman as if they would pop out of their sockets. I didn't know the reason for this at the time, but I found out later. In order to get help from a jinn who is not a Muslim, it is necessary to do things that humiliate Islam. That's why the woman did it that way. The fortune-teller got up and came right in front of us. He burned the black stones that I had not seen before in the room in a container. There was a black smoke coming out of the burning thing. The smoke covered the whole room. He started to say some words that I guessed were in Arabic, looking at the burning fire. But very quickly, I couldn't understand what he was saying. He stopped and started talking in Turkish. He said, "O learned Kasum, do not be born of fire. Kasum, give voice to those who were created from this helpless earth." And he asked me, "What is your name?" I said my name. He started talking again in a language I don't understand, this time slowly. "And he really used the body," he said. "There was such a smoke from the fire that it made the whole room dark." He looked at me again. "There is a spell on him that will not leave his 7 cedars. There's 7 seds, your 7 seds," he said. "It's a very powerful spell," he said. "Why did someone do this magic? How am I going to get out of this?" I said, "This haunting was not done to you, but to a descendant of your family. We will make a deal with them. There is no other way with the tribe that haunts you and your family," he said. "How will this agreement be?" I said, "It won't happen now," he said. "After 9 in the evening, bring me the materials I want. He will be in this house after the 9 evening mass, and if they agree to the agreement, this spell, this haunting will be over," he said. "But you will not tell anyone about this until that time comes. If anyone knows more about them and the haunting, you will wrap them around your head even more," he said. He told me the materials he wanted. I will not right here now. I will try to find them and tell them in future. After I told him the supplies I needed to bring in case there might be people trying to practice the ritual, he said, "Get out of here quickly." It was getting dark. It was about to be dusk. We left the fortune-teller woman's house. I'm trying to get my thoughts together, but I can't get them together. If something like this happened to you, how would you feel?" I lit a cigarette, and we drove off in Bakai's car. Who among my descendants were they haunted by? At that moment, a spark literally flashed through my mind. I remember the day I went to that funeral. It was the first time I saw women in loincloths there, at my grandmother's house in the entrance hall, standing and waiting with a tilted face, while they were trying to get the funeral out. No one was pretending that they were there. It was the same cemetery. Did all this really have something to do with Grandma, or was I making this up in my head? But there must have been a point in all this happening right after my grandmother died. Was the plague infected on me? There were thousands of questions in my brain. I couldn't stop until I found the answer to all this. I said to Burkai, "Drop me at the bus station. I will return to my hometown. I need to tell everyone at home about all that happened." She reminded me of what the fortune teller woman said. She said you shouldn't tell anyone or something, but I didn't even listen to her. As soon as possible, I took the bus to my hometown and got off at home. The first light of the morning had just begun to illuminate the village. I thought about a few days ago what a normal life I had when I came for the funeral, and what a life I have now. When I stood in front of my grandmother's house, I was deconstructed from all these thoughts. That's where it all started. First, I examined the house from the outside for a while. I decided to go in both because of the lightening of the weather and out of curiosity. The lightening of the weather, at least, gave courage. I looked at the door. It was unlocked. It was open. Why didn't Dad lock it? I said, but I didn't dwell on it too much. I went inside. It was orderly inside. I looked at the photos on the wall. There were no abnormalities. My grandmother has a cargo box where she keeps her things. Those who know. It usually happens in old houses. At that moment, it occurred to me to look there. I opened the lid. There were deck chairs. I put my hand between them to see if I could find anything. I couldn't. This is not going to be like this. I took down all the duvets, mattresses. I found a metal box wrapped in a sheet, and I opened it right away. There were photos in it. I took the first photo in my hand. It was a photo of my grandparents. This is a photo taken in this house. They were sitting next to each other on the sofa bed, smiling and posing. Oh, and if only they had real faces. I can't describe to you the fear I was experiencing at that moment. The awfulness of the smiling faces in the photo. Feeling scared and terrified, I immediately left the photo where it was. I just wanted to get out of the house. I went to the door, tried to open it. It wouldn't open. I turned around. They were in front of me. My grandfather and grandmother were sitting on the sofa bed opposite me, looking at me, just like in the photo, in the same way. But the people in front of me were real. They were not photo frames. Ash, Lihu, Janaya on the set. They both said at once. Their faces became even more disgusting and terrible. They were pointing to the window with their hands. Said Ash, Liu, Jinia, they say, pointing to the side of the window. I turned my head to the side of the window. 4 women in loincloths were in front of the window. Again, in the same way, their faces are tilted to the ground. I turn my head back in the direction of my grandparents. They were not sitting on the sofa bed. They were at the bottom. They were just inches away from me, with their horrible faces. I can feel their breath. Then, the cases of the bus. I woke up with a shaking. I immediately drank from the water next to me. My throat was burning, literally. Anyway, I got off the bus and came to the village. A crowd had gathered in front of my grandmother's house. Some were sitting on chairs. Some were waiting, standing up. Also, sounds similar to prayer were coming from where the crowd was gathered. The sounds in Arabic made me feel afraid. But when I listened to these sounds, I realized that they were not the same as what the women in loincloths were saying. This has refreshed me a little bit. When I approached the crowd with this relief, I realized that they were gathered for Mevlut. The teacher, microphone in hand, was reading. So I sat down in a corner. I'm waiting for the breakup of the nation, the breakup of Mevlut, to tell my family what I've been through. Anyway, the teacher finished his reading. The people started to get up slowly. After that, the uncles sitting in the chairs next to me started talking among themselves. Dick, at first, I wasn't interested in what they were talking about, but then they started talking about things that would make me pay attention. An old uncle was saying, "May Allah forgive him. We are praying after him, but his sins were great." They used to say that they made a spell on the first wife of the eldest son and separated her. It is not known how true it is, but this is what happens. Said one of the uncles who listened to him said, "That's right, that's right." He approved. Was it really true what they were talking about? Or was it just a rumor, but there was no smoke coming out of a place where there was no fire? Who was my uncle's ex-wife? I had never heard from anyone that my uncle had left until today. Was there an attempt to hide something or something? After Mevlut, when everyone scattered, my mother said, "Why did you come?" Said, "I had one exam. I made up a lie so that I could get into it and catch up with Mevlut. However, I didn't even know that he was a Mevlut. I decided not to tell what I had experienced right away. My goal was to investigate something about my uncle's ex-wife, my grandmother's ex-wife, my grandmother. Actually, I had no idea what I was looking for, what I was going to find, but I had to search the house. It was like something was poking me. I went in. I looked at the cargo first, as in a dream. I opened the lid, lifted the duvets. There was a box wrapped in a sheet like in my dream. I was afraid in my gut that I would see the same as in my dream. In this hesitation, I opened the box. There were photos in it, but the first photo was not like the one in my dream. There was my grandfather, uncle, and a woman in the photo. The woman was closed. She had looked at the photo in a bored way. For no reason, I connected with women in loincloths decked out between them. Maybe I was looking at the faces of women whose faces I've always been curious about in the photo I had. What was that about? I should have asked my dad. I'm calling my uncle on the phone, but his phone is turned off. He's not at home either, and my aunt doesn't know where he is. While I was lighting a cigarette to clear my head, my phone rang. It was Burke calling. "What have you done? Have you told your parents about what happened?" he says, in an agitated voice. "No, I didn't," I said, "but I found a photo at my grandmother's house. There was also a woman I had never met in the photo. Neither does my father," I said. Burke said, "Come here right now. Let's show the photo to the fortune-teller woman." Said, "My uncle is in the photo. Besides, I've heard something about him here. Actually, I thought it would be better if I talked to him, but I can't reach my uncle. You come here. Let's go to the fortune-teller woman. Photography is an important thing," said, "an object that is used even when magic is being performed. The fortune-teller woman sees things thanks to that photo." Said, "Could he have been right? I couldn't reach my uncle either. Anyway, things had gotten really weird. What would I have lost? If I showed the photo to the fortune-teller woman, maybe she would see something, as Burke said, and she could tell me who she was." "All right, I said to Burke, "I'm coming." A few hours later, I was finally next to Burke in the city where I was studying at university. We jumped into his car, headed for the fortune-teller woman's house. We hardly spoke to Burke on the way. He had a strange mood on him. He had only talked to me to see the photo. Anyway, we got to the fortune-teller woman's house. We knocked on her door. With that sinister face, the fortune-teller woman opened the door. As if he hadn't washed for years, the wrinkles on his face were black. "Why have you come?" Said, "Didn't I tell you to come back in 9 days, 9 nights?" Said, "I didn't say anything. I just showed the photo. I want to know what's in this photo. That's why I came. Help me with your knowledge." I said, "Come in," he said, after I said these things. We went inside. He took the photo from my hand. He filled half of a container with water, then took the bottle with a red liquid from the only table in the house. When he opened the lid, a stench covered the room. It was the smell of blood. Who knows which creature's blood it was? He also spilled some blood into the container, which he half filled with water. Later, he cut the part where the woman was in the photo. He threw the part he cut into the container. He began to mix it with his index finger, water and blood along with the photo. He started mumbling and reading something, but I'm not going to write them down here because they're dark, unknown words that are directly related to invoking Ifrit. The words that started out as a murmur were being said more and more loudly. Voices were echoing in the room now. "Elazine Feriha, Minhase Azeferun Nsheri." At last stopped, turning his face towards the Captain Me. "Your grandmother has cast a spell on this woman, my son, that is, on your daughter-in-law. No one remembers his name, his existence, because of magic. The magic is very powerful, very effective. May Allah forgive your grandmother. All of your sins are on her neck. All of your grandmother's descendants will suffer the punishment of this magic. They will go crazy, start seeing things that don't exist. they will all disappear screaming. Said, how could my grandmother, whom I have never seen any evil of until today, have done such things? Was I going to be punished for what he did? Was I going to get involved in demons? Was I going to go crazy? So, just why was I going through all this? While I was in these thoughts, the voice of the fortune-teller woman brought me to myself. There are two ways to get out of this. Either you make a deal with those who haunt you, or you burn them all. The jinn given to you and your family are very powerful demons. They disagree. There is only one way to burn them. But my knowledge is not enough for that. Those who haunt you are too powerful. You can't do this job here. Said, how am I going to do it? How am I going to get rid of it? I said, there is a teacher in the village of Diardva. His knowledge is very wide. He is the person who can help you get out of here. Find him now, said. As we approached the village, the road had deteriorated completely. We were now driving on a dirt road. Finally, we came to the village. There was a small mosque in the village, but it was very old. The lights were not on. In fact, it was almost not clear that it was even a mosque. It was very poorly maintained. I only said mosque because it has a very small minaret. A few people were sitting on chairs in the village square, standing without speaking. If I say coffee, it wasn't coffee. They were sitting like idols in the square, as you know. We got out of the car, went to them. Can you show me the teacher's house? I said. He pointed with his hand to the hill opposite me, a few 100 meters away, without opening his mouth. It was a strange village, no doubt. Okay, thanks, uncle. I said. He didn't even answer. Come on, Burke. I said, let's walk. As I was walking along the road, something else caught my attention. There were no cars in the village, apart from the animals on the street. There was no movement in the village. We arrived at the teacher's house on the hill together with Burke. I knocked on the door. A few seconds later, the door was opened by the person I guessed to be the teacher. He had a long beard, but he could be considered young. Here you are, said. Teacher, I said, there is something wrong with me, but they said you could solve it. When I said these things, he was not looking towards me. Don't wait at the door. Let's talk inside. Here you are, said. We went inside. Sit down, my child, he said when we entered the room where the door opened. There were 2 sofa beds opposite each other in the room. Anyway, Burke and I sat on one of them, and the teacher sat on the other sofa bed, right in front of us. Salam alaikum, said. Alaikum salam. I said, Alaikum salam. I replied. Who described this place, this house to you? Did you see any unusual? Said. There were 2 old men sitting in the village square, but they never spoke. They pointed with their hands. That's how we found this house, this place. I said. He nodded, meaning I understood. Later, tell me about your problem. Said. I told what had happened to me without skipping a word. The teacher listened quietly, just. When I finished explaining, he said, We don't have time. He said, We'll hurry up. He went into the room, Teacher, at that time I looked at Burkeye. He was calm. The excitement and fear in me seemed to disappear in him. At this time, the teacher came back to the room. He had exactly 3 candles in his hand and a paper. He turned towards us, closed the curtains, and turned out the light. Afterwards, sit on the floor, kneeling. Said, we immediately did what he said. We closed all the curtains and turned off the light. It was already a night without a moon, and when the curtains were closed, we were left in pitch darkness until the teacher began to light the candles one by one. Now, there was a weak light given by 3 candles in the room. With the movement of the candle flames, the shadows on the wall also seemed to move. Hadja made the paper in his hand into 3 pieces and burned the 3 papers separately in the candles that he arranged in front of us all. The papers he had burned were burning with a red and then blue flame, and their smoke covered the room. After burning the paper in the flame of 3 candles, the teacher bent his head forward, began to read something while mumbling, and then his voice rose. He was saying, Win VNT Anor. He repeated this word aloud 3 times. A smoke that you wouldn't believe came out of those little papers, covered the room. Hadja had finished his words, lifted his face off the floor, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Burkay. Who are you? He said, looking at her. Burkay said. Only the teacher asked, what did he want revenge for? He wanted revenge on the one who took away the girl he loved, she said. The girl he loves. How could I take away Burkay's beloved from him? How could I do this to my best friend? I couldn't do it. Or did he like one of the girls I threw in his house and had something with, Burkay? Well, if he had told me that, would I have ever laid a hand on that girl? Why didn't he tell me? Was this the reason for the haunting that happened to me? Did it all start because Burkay had a grudge against me? Did he have nothing to do with my grandmother's death? I looked at the teacher, sitting opposite me. While I had these thoughts in my mind, I was going to lose my mind with the sight I saw. He just said, God, help me. I was able to say, when I came to my senses 3 days later, I was in an abandoned, ruined house, that village. No one was living. My eyes searched for Burkay, but there was no. He has disappeared. Everyone said the gendarme couldn't find it. Like Mustafa, the beekeeper, whom Burkay also told me he's gone crazy. And they said he disappeared. He died. Say, but I know that you have mingled with them and disappeared in screams. Although no one believes me, I will never know what the being I thought was a teacher is. Maybe, but his image will never leave my mind.